All right, gentlemen, today's lecture is about Vietnamization. The term, as you can assume from its natural state, talks about how the war and the strategy behind the war effort shifted from the American concept of escalation to one of Vietnamization and the inclusion of more Vietnamese troops and resources to the effort. The questions I want to talk about are: how did the American government come to this strategy? Why escalation failed and got replaced by Vietnamization? And was Vietnamization fundamentally flawed at its core? In the time frame, I want to go from the Tet Offensive of 1968 to the fall of Saigon in 1975. That means this is the last fighting done by the Americans, as well as the last pieces of what will include American action in South Vietnam and the end of that nation itself. I want to talk about an analogy with the American Revolution. Think of the revolution itself: patriots, sons of liberty, new birth of freedom, Declaration of Independence, etc. Maybe even the Boston Massacre. Can you name some battles of the Revolution? Bunker Hill, maybe? Okay, great. Saratoga? Yeah, maybe you've done a little bit of study about this. Would you know Princeton? How about Trenton and the Christmas invasion? No? How about Ticonderoga? You've probably heard Ticonderoga. But I bet you've heard Yorktown, which is the last battle, land battle of the war. These are the major American victories. The rest of the battles, they went to the British. So how, if the British won all of these battles, did they still lose the war? And more importantly, why? Vietnam and American efforts in Vietnam followed this similar analogy. I want you to think about support on the home front, the events that happen abroad, and assumptions about the war made by the men who fought it. Keep that in mind as we study the end of the American involvement here. Now, I said I wanted to pick up at Tet, so let's talk about Tet real quick. There's a great deal of confidence in the American government that come 1968, Westmoreland's right. The tide has turned, that things have been done, that the tipping point has been reached. This is shattered when the NVA, the North Vietnamese Army, invade in the Lunar New Year at the end of January 1968. The goal of the NVA was to inspire an uprising, to collapse ARVN and the South Vietnamese regime, to provide strong points of power that would lead to the mass defection of the ARVN troops. It was to convince the civilians of the South that the North was here to liberate them, that the South could not protect them, and that the future lay with communism. And finally, it was to take over the urban centers, the cities that had been the strong points of the South Vietnamese and American program, using conventional warfare. The North Vietnamese and Viet Cong had long controlled the countryside and rural areas because their programs appealed to these people, and quite frankly, the other groups, the Americans and the South Vietnamese, concentrated all their forces on the urban areas. Attacking the cities would be the last part. The American goals in this area were about the depiction of the fighting. There has to be an end in sight. There has to be a tipping point in Westmoreland's philosophy. And there has to be a willingness of the American people to support continued actions. When Tet breaks out, its big impact is it has interpretive events that interfere with all three of these things. So, let's talk about Tet. Over 100 major cities in the South are invaded by conventional forces of the North Vietnamese Army and Viet Cong insurgents. This is about 84,000 North Vietnamese troops with unknown thousands of VC auxiliaries. Out of that group, statistics are hard to pull out, but approximately 37,000 casualties amongst these 84,000 troops are accepted as fairly normal. And you compare that with approximately 500 American casualties, and you can see an overwhelming military victory for the Americans and their South Vietnamese allies. The South Vietnamese themselves took probably around 6,000 casualties, but American firepower and South Vietnamese implementation in a conventional warfare fought by the North led to a situation where massive casualties were inflicted upon North Vietnamese troops. In May of that year, a mini-Tet sees 36,000 more NVA deaths. And I mean deaths, not just casualties in this situation. But that also saw 2,400 more American deaths. Now, how it impacts the narrative has always been part of the question for interpretation. And really, there are four things that pop up at this point. The first is that it was a massive win lost in the American public because of the way the media depicted it. This is one that you're probably familiar with. Another interpretation was that Tet showed the weakness of American public opinion, that it was very fragile and could be fractured quickly when anything went against the American war effort. The third, it exposed a gap between what the administration was saying and what the situation on the ground and the reality actually was. This has probably been the most popular of the most recent interpretations, and it's called the credibility gap. Option 4 was that it exposed the efforts of the ARVN as brutal and made it hard for the American public to support a South Vietnamese ally. This one's been a little bit shaded, but I think you can understand the logic of it. In reality, it's a mixture of these things with some other pieces as well. I want to give you some stats. These come from Peter Berstrup, and he was writing in a story, or a book, Big Story, How the American Press and Television Reported and Interpreted the Crisis of Tet in Vietnam and Washington. This comes from Yale's University Press at Yale. Okay, Berstrup said, a Gallup poll in January of 1968 revealed that 56% polled considered themselves hawks on war and 27% doves, with 17% offering no opinion. Okay, Mr. Doobie interpretive side note here. That means 56% of the people in this poll, and again, there's questions about how representational this poll was, considered themselves in support of the Vietnamese conflict and of American efforts there. 27% of people considered themselves to be doves, which meant heavily in favor of peace and moving out of Vietnam. Now look, we have a cultural memory that says that Vietnam was an unpopular war, protested, disliked, hated. And yet, in 1968, 3 years into the fighting, 10 years, maybe even 15 into American support for South Vietnam, over half of the country in this poll still considered themselves in favor of the war and the way it's being executed. 17% had no opinion, so they could be persuaded. Now, back to Berstrup. By early February, at the height of the first phase of the Tet Offensive, 61% declared themselves hawks. So you see here a 5% increase in support for the war during the Tet Offensive. It didn't drive support away, it drove support towards the war. 23% doves, which is down 4%, and 16% held no opinion. Again, down 1%. Johnson, and this is LBJ, however, made few comments to the press during or immediately after the offensive, leaving an impression of indecision on the public. It was this lack of communication that caused a rising disapproval rating for his conduct of the war. By the end of February, his approval rating had fallen from 63% to 47%. By the end of March, the percentage of Americans that expressed confidence in U.S. military policies in Southeast Asia had fallen from 74% to 54%. Now think about those numbers for just a second. To get to that lower level of 47% approval rating for LBJ, he had to fall from 63%. He was a popular president executing a popular war in 1968. And it fell off because of his inability to communicate about the war and his lack of communication. It wasn't Walter Cronkite saying we lost America. It wasn't the picture of the execution during the Tet Offensive. We have people who are very much in support of what's being done, a complicated understanding of the war by many Americans that's undone because of a lack of communication, a lack of being given information. And even at the end of this, think about that last stat. By the end of March, the percentage of Americans that express confidence in U.S. military policies. So, are you confident in the military policies of America in Southeast Asia? Fell from 74%, which is 3 out of every 4 people, high number to begin with, to 54%, still more than half. I think we have to deal with some of our own cultural hang-ups that people resented the Vietnam War during its fighting. There are moments when there are certain subsections that do, but the average American does not protest or hate the war even during the Tet Offensive. That comes later, and some of that might come from nostalgia. Lest we forget, America was not the only one involved in fighting this war. The implications and repercussions in South Vietnam were heard as well. This is the first time that the North Vietnamese army had attacked civilian targets. There are 2,000 civilians executed at Hue. Americans had made errors in gaining support for the war with Ngo, and the NVA then made the error here. NVA tactics persuaded many on the fence to support the South Vietnamese government. So, while on the one hand, it exposes South Vietnamese citizens to aggression in the war at a level that had not been done before, it also leads to a large growth of the South Vietnamese army and new questions about how well the South Vietnamese can protect their citizens. So it was not a crushing moment as often is portrayed, but the South Vietnamese army vastly increased in size in response to these efforts. The other thing at play here were larger issues in the world. The first probably being the capture of the USS Pueblo, which was an American freight and personnel carrying ship that had been outfitted for reconnaissance work. It was taken in what the American Navy claims to be international waters off of North Korea by the North Koreans in a rather interesting incident. You should probably look that up on your own, USS Pueblo. The Soviet army has marched in Czechoslovakia in response to protests. And it's the reason, if you guys who follow hockey out there remember Jaromir Jagr, war number 68 was in memory of this year. There's a crisis in the Middle East. The 1967 Six-Day War has now led to a war of attrition. The civil rights movement in the United States has flared up to the point, and quite frankly, has spilled over to the point where American Army troops and reservists are being called out to quell or quiet the disputes. So things become complicated in a year in which there's also a presidential election. During the campaign of 1968, troop withdrawals are part of the normal discussion. You learn from the episode on the Vietnam War that Johnson is going to refuse his party's nomination, clearing the way for Nixon, the opposition party's candidate, former vice president and governor of California, not to mention senator in the time of the McCarthy trials, to make himself out to be the peace candidate. He's promising troop withdrawals. When Nixon wins the election, he talks about peace with honor. In April 1970, this is 2 years after the election, B-52s are bombing areas of Cambodia where the NVA bases are. On May 1st, there's a huge successful incursion of the South Vietnamese army with American advisors into Cambodia, and it exposes huge bases and supplies that were vital parts of the Ho Chi Minh Trail. However, there are consequences to escalating the war in a country that had been neutral to this point. The first of the three major consequences is that the North Vietnamese considered this just one more battleground of the war. Instead of being a neutral country which they were passing through and operating out of, it's now opened up as a theater in the war. This destabilizes Cambodia as a country, having massive amounts of troops in it fighting against each other, and Cambodia falls into a civil war between communist and capitalist-backed forces. That civil war leaves the South Vietnamese to try to stabilize the situation. One of the groups is a pro-communist group and therefore the natural enemy of the South Vietnamese government. A lot of resources went into securing the capital at Phnom Penh that could not be used elsewhere in the South Vietnamese theater. The expansion of the conflict at a time when the United States government was claiming that the war was being won and winding down led to massive protests on the domestic scale. This is what leads to the infamous Kent State Massacre. This is where troops, or the American National Guard, were sent to protect the property at Kent State University, and eventually shots are fired into the protesters and civilian students die. Again, something else worth looking up when you have time. Now, Nixon's philosophy of Vietnamization can most basically be defined as making the war the specific providence of the Vietnamese. That is, the war should be fought primarily by the Vietnamese in their country, with their soldiers, with American military and economic support, but not American troops. Now, there are issues. The South Vietnamese army, because it is working with the Americans, often only sends its best troops into battle. That means as long as the best troops perform well, they're the only ones who fight, and the units with issues continue to have issues that never come to light. Because there are Americans in country, they do most of the fighting. Most of the South Vietnamese army spends time doing pacification, and those troops never progress from being new recruits and green soldiers into being the veterans needed to win a war. They just don't see combat. The invasion of Laos in 1971 had American advisors used at each level of the South Vietnamese army. And when those advisors are not present, the leadership and performance suffers. Basically, the army of South Vietnam became dependent on American advisors to make decisions within the army because the Americans depended upon it. And you're now late enough in the war that the tradition is such that the officers in the South Vietnamese army have all come up with Americans making decisions. When those advisors aren't present, again, those decisions suffer. The use of air power was fine as long as there was air superiority. The North Vietnamese get better anti-aircraft missiles, and helicopters take huge losses during the invasion of Laos. After 20 years of working with the South Vietnamese, they fought like the Americans. As the U.S. withdrew its troops and its weapons, the South Vietnamese, who fought like Americans, which depended upon firepower and air superiority, suddenly lacked that firepower and the ability to deploy aircraft in support of their mission that had always been part of their battle. Last of the worldwide issues here is détente. There's a theory called MAD, mutually assured destruction. And the madman theory is that you will be prevented from having a nuclear war because no one is crazy enough to start a nuclear war, because it can't be won. As long as both sides have nuclear weapons, no one will start the war. Improved relations between the Americans, the Soviet Union, and the Chinese in the early 70s in this détente mean that there's nuclear arms reduction. Certain missiles are taken out of commission. Subs are limited. The Americans are moving away from a hard-edged Cold War approach. While at the same time, the continued supply of the North by communist countries means that they're not stepping away from their commitments in Vietnam, even as the Americans see it as a natural path or a natural way forward from their current policies. In addition to these international relations, there was also controversies about the way the war was fought itself. The My Lai massacre involved 200 civilians, mostly women and children, and old men, who were murdered by American military troops. And if this event was not bad enough, the event is covered up. Only one American soldier faced court-martial or trial over the action, and that was the commanding officer. Eventually, this man is sentenced to life in prison, life of hard labor, which is then reduced to 25 years for good behavior. And in the end, the man is released after serving only 5 years in prison with a dishonorable discharge. This event, this horrible military murder, went basically unpunished. And people understood this, and they saw it happening. In 1970, the Pentagon Papers are published, and it reveals what the government has known and questioned all along. It shows that the CIA has been providing assessments that people had worried about from the very beginning. It's having all the meeting notes suddenly public so that people can see when people have doubt. The whole idea that you provide a strong front, that you tell people that things are going well, it falls apart in 1970 because suddenly you can see the doubts within the government itself. and the acknowledgement that the war is not being won and maybe can't be won. And this is called the credibility gap. In 1972, at An Loc, there's an Easter offensive. Much like Tet, the plan by the North Vietnamese is to hit the major population centers. Instead of using guerrilla Viet Cong, the NVA are going to do the heavy fighting. It's not an insurgency. It means fewer small arms and the use for the first time by the North Vietnamese by tanks in large numbers. This is full modern warfare fought in a conventional manner. And the goal was to show how Vietnamization had failed and to reveal that the South Vietnamese could not protect their own people. Now, as you can imagine, full conventional warfare is exactly what the American Air Force and armed forces in general had been preparing for, well, since the beginning of World War II. The necessity of American air support is understood by General Clayton Abrams, now in charge of American troops in South Vietnam. When the attacks start on March 30th, 1972, you see thousands of heavy artillery and tanks from the north come rolling in. In a month of fighting, though, the South Vietnamese army loses nearly all of its artillery and all but one of their tanks. However, supported by massive amounts of American air power, they inflict extreme casualties on the north. At the Battle of An Loc, the invasion revealed complications. The North Vietnamese choice of conventional warfare exposed their supplies of fuel and ammo to American aircraft. They are targeted by these aircraft and destroyed. Over and over again, American air power makes a huge difference. But this only works as long as Americans are willing to support the South Vietnamese government or provide aircraft to fight. What happens in the countryside? How well can the South Vietnamese government secure the safety of the people? And it looks like there can be ground regained. The battle goes so swimmingly well for the South Vietnamese and the Americans that, well, it looks like South Vietnam may have actually won its victory. This battle and invasion, among all others, crushes the North Vietnamese army for the second time in 3 years. That destruction prevents it from launching offensive operations until 1975. It takes 2 more years to rebuild. And it looks like the Americans have settled into a place where they're willing to support the war with air power, if not with boots on the ground. 1972, however, is also an election year in the United States. Nixon is up for re-election and is quite possibly one of the most popular American presidents and incumbents. He is well liked. His policies in Vietnam seem to be working. American soldiers are coming home. The South Vietnamese nation continues to succeed. Nixon has a bombing program called Linebacker 2, hit Hanoi and Haiphong harbors, and they push the North Vietnamese to the negotiation tables in Paris. And there's a desire to sign an armistice. It looks like the war could end here. The U.S. wants out, and they pressure the South Vietnamese to sign. The USSR wants a solution as well and is pressuring the North Vietnamese to sign. The North Vietnamese are in a tough spot after failing on the Easter Offensive and in Tet, and their army is in no shape to invade again. The South Vietnamese are in a tough spot because they need American air power and American advisors, as well as economic support, to continue their fight. And in early 1973, all three sign. That would be the Americans, the North Vietnamese, and the South Vietnamese, though there are serious reservations on the side of the South. This is a ceasefire, an armistice. Prisoners were exchanged. The North Vietnamese could continue to supply troops in the South, but the Saigon government of President Thu was to remain in power. This all sounds good until you start looking at the problems. The terms were negotiated in secret without President Thu of South Vietnam, and he only learned of them when the terms were presented to him later as agreed upon. That's problematic. You've made an agreement without your primary ally from the American point of view. When the American advisors leave, which is part of the armistice, is the removal of American ground troops, the command structure of the South Vietnamese army would take a huge hit. Without American troops and support personnel, all of the advanced military equipment left behind would not have regular maintenance or be serviced or operated at the same level. There are breakdowns that occur. There are no spare parts because the Americans aren't there to ship them in, and there's a lack of maintenance. Then there are the larger world issues like a worldwide oil crisis, which caused the prices to skyrocket, and both sides stopped using their vehicles and aircraft as much. Now, the South Vietnamese were hurt much harder, a disproportionately large amount, because they relied on the American method of fighting with aircraft and vehicles. Finally, the ARVN focused its strategy on protecting the populated areas that it could best control, and therefore lost control of the countryside. The American Congress, domestically, reacted to pressure from the American people to put restrictions on the aid to Vietnam. And more problems arose around spare parts and resupply. American actions in Laos and Cambodia ended in 1973 when Congress just straight cut funds, would not fund the American effort there, and troops had to be brought home. All of this was a result of a lack of support that Nixon engendered for himself after 1972. 1972's presidential election was a landslide. It looked like Nixon could ride a wave of goodwill towards any conclusion in Vietnam that he wanted. But then Watergate happens. Nixon's paranoia catches up with him. His spying on the Democrats and concern about, well, quite frankly, his misplaced concern about the 1972 election meant that Nixon resigns. And during the conflict that led up to that resignation, Congress could not support anything he asked for without hurting themselves. And it swings Democrat. Specifically, the House of Representatives becomes the home of a Democratic majority, and even more reductions on spending are put in place on the Vietnam War. Vietnam is seen as the political issue that Democrats can hold on to swing the power structure in Vietnam. Because at this point, things have started to go down the road towards unpopularity. That slides us into 1975. The North Vietnamese attacked Phu Long province north of Saigon. And for the first time, the United States does not react. The North Vietnamese had used the 3 years armistice to rebuild their army and their troops, as well as re-equip themselves with supplies from China and the Soviet Union. President Gerald Ford wants to respond, but Congress will not approve the money to act. So American military forces on station, ready to go, no longer in country, however, will not react. There's no money. The North Vietnamese army presses the attack. Now they see there'll be no American reaction. Thu pulls all of his troops back to defend a smaller area, but the troops retreat poorly and cause panic. Because while the North Vietnamese rebuilt their army in the 3 years, the South Vietnamese army falls apart. The defenses in Saigon don't last long. 7,000 people are moved from Saigon to Navy ships. Most of these are not Americans. They are collaborators, people who have worked with the American effort in Vietnam. 5,600 of them, in fact, are non-Americans. And the last 2 American casualties are 2 Marines killed at the evacuation zone and 2 helicopter pilots who die moving people out to the ships. So ends in 1975 American military involvement in Vietnam. Not because of military defeat, but because, in the end, there was a domestic undoing. But it was not in 1968. It was much later. So the questions I led with: how did the American government come to this strategy? It was seen as a natural, what should we call it, progression of philosophy. It would preserve American lives and let American firepower do the fighting. Escalation failed because Johnson's inability to communicate purpose in Vietnam meant that the American public could not see why the war was being fought at that point and demanded more troops. Vietnamization was not fundamentally flawed, but poorly executed in many ways. Although you can probably make the argument that the poor execution may have been a fundamental flaw. And finally, the analogy about the American Revolution. The Americans and the South Vietnamese won every major battle in the Vietnam War. They inflicted massive casualties. And yet, events abroad, support at home, and assumptions made about how the war was going to be fought and its purpose prevented them from winning the war. So once again, all of the battles were won and the war was lost in Vietnam.